Welcome to Happy Talks with Dr. Alice and Donovan. Dr. Alice Fong is a holistic naturopathic doctor and founder of Amor de Soi Wellness, and Donovan Jensen is a software engineer and founder of HowToHappy.com. Together, they're out to cause more happiness in the world.
Hi everyone, welcome to Happy Talks. Today we are going to talk about how to deal with anger. And this is a common thing that we're all dealing with at some point or another. So I'm curious, Donovan, what do you do or what tools do you utilize to deal with anger for yourself?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to sidestep the question slightly and jump in at the point of really talking about like the relationship with anger, because I feel like that's very important and it plays in heavily with how you actually deal with it. And I feel like in the past for me, and I see this with a lot of other people as well, but they have this belief around anger as something that helps drive them sometimes and something that can help them achieve more. So for example, one of the ones that was very common for me in the past is like being told I wouldn't be able to do something, right? Like a very common trope type thing, like, hey, you'll never be able to, I don't know, work at this company or do this thing or whatever. And for me, like I've had those experiences of being told I won't be able to do something, then feeling angry, and then using that as motivation to push forward. But the thing that I've learned later that I was missing, because for a long time I was like, oh, anger is this thing that I really need to be productive. It's like the most useful way for me to get a lot of stuff done. And later I've kind of learned or found out that those same types of feelings, which what underlies it is basically like I want to be good at things or like I want to be able to accomplish things,
right,
can drive me without sitting in the anger for a long time. So by that I mean, you know, there might be an initial spark, and I think anger is an emotion that kind of drives you to do something. But after that initial spark, it's not necessarily something that you need to sit in and stew in and feed and like grow. You can take whatever the message or the action is out of it and then use that without carrying around the baggage of the negative emotion piece. So here's an example. Like, let's say that I get some feedback that I'm not performing in my job as well as, up to expectations. I might feel anger at first, like, what? Like, let's say it's unfair. Let's say for whatever reason it's unfair. And I feel angry like, oh, this is so unfair. Like, I did do this thing that this other person's getting credit for, type of thing. So in the past, I would have taken that piece of anger and maybe for a week, a month, just fueled it and like, this is so unfair, this is ridiculous, like, and just like really played into the emotion. As opposed to now, I can kind of see like, oh, I feel angry. Okay, what's the message in this emotion? Which is like something unfair is happening, or something I perceive to be unfair is happening. What actions can I take to kind of resolve this scenario? Because the emotion means something. Like it's important that it's there. But then going from there to find the solution, but letting some of the emotion go away. So I'm not holding on to for weeks or whatever else these feelings that make me feel bad overall. They push me to action but make me feel bad, and just taking the action, still knowing that like, okay, there are things that need to be done. There's a reason that I'm angry. There is a purpose. There's stuff that needs to happen. But dropping that emotion and being in a more clear, level-headed place. Because I also found that I would make less efficient choices. I would look for solutions that weren't as good because my mind would be fogged up with kind of the anger, and I wouldn't be able to kind of solve whatever the underlying issue was very well. So for me, I guess that's one of the biggest things that's helped me deal with anger, is to just change my relationship with it. And maybe in a little bit we can talk about some more like specific in the moment things. But for me, that's the most common experience with anger, is these kind of longer, drawn out emotional sessions that I just keep feeding, and I keep feeding the thoughts. I'm just recognizing that, yes, it's not that I want to avoid anger. I just want to take the message and then, feel the emotion, process it, but let it go instead of holding on to it. I'd be curious kind of what some of your initial thoughts are around the topic of dealing with anger are.
Yeah, I feel like I have a very different experience, and I don't know if it's being a woman or maybe just being a minority and like Asian culture. I guess, I think we're taught to not be expressive, especially not with, negative emotions like anger or even sadness to really express that. So I feel like part of my upbringing was like, you're not allowed to be angry. And I think it does tie into being a woman. Like women, when they're like upset, they're perceived as this crazy woman that, you know, hysterical, irrational, and which is very unfair. So there's some sexism involved, I think, with the whole emotions of anger. I do feel gratitude for being a woman because I feel like we have the privilege to have an all-encompassing view, or we're allowed to, you know, have a wide range of emotions and express them more freely, whereas I think men typically, you know, they're only allowed to express anger and that's it. That's it. Like no other feelings, but just anger is like the acceptable emotion to have, where all of us, we're human beings, we all have a wide spectrum of emotions, and it's okay to have emotions, but the acceptability isn't always even for every person. As far as like having it drive me forward, I don't know if I can say that really happens. Maybe to some degree. I definitely do agree with the whole idea of not being always rational with the driving force, or not being as logical or efficient with our thought process when we're angry, because the anger is kind of just like coloring everything with this red filter of like anger. And I'm trying to think of some examples of anger, and I think usually when I do feel anger, I have sense, you know, I don't know when I've been more comfortable at some point in my life, maybe mid-20s to 30s, and now like I feel like perfectly comfortable to express anger, whereas before I think I was suppressed to some degree. But when I do feel anger, like people know it, you will know if I'm angry at you. But usually I feel like I can efficiently like get out of it when I like think about the logic behind it, and when I come from a place of like, okay, what am I really angry about? You know, what is that underlying feeling? Like usually there's some sort of sense of injustice towards me or someone I care about that propels the anger. Like, oh, this is so unfair, this is ridiculous, this same as you, just this is not right. And that propels the anger, and it can be fueled. But when I break it down and maybe try to understand it from their perspective, and this is, you know, something we've regularly talked about in our other episodes, and when I can like, you know, step away from like all my feelings and just like take a step back and look at it from a third party person, like, you know, maybe they weren't trying to be hurtful, maybe they weren't trying to be malicious, and they said or did something just out of ignorance, or maybe, or, you know, even if they were trying to be like a dick, it's just like, you know, do I really want that anger to fuel, like, I do feel my anger, but I don't want to hold on to anger, because it's just like that common saying, you know, having anger for someone else is like drinking poison for yourself. It's just like, it's a very uncomfortable feeling to be with, but it's, you know, it's something that I see as like valid to experience, and it's just like unavoidable occasionally, because, you know, the world is not like a perfect place. There's a lot of, you know, injustices happening, especially right now, like on a global scale. And it's okay to be angry. Although, actually, I just thought of this one thing that my 3-year-old nephew, he watches, actually both my nephew and my niece, they watch the Daniel Tiger like cartoon, and my nephew sings the song that Daniel Tiger sings, and I was like, oh, that is exactly what we need right now. The song goes like, stop, it's okay to be angry, but it's not okay to hurt anyone. That's how the song goes. And I was just like, yeah, I think it's a way to validate our anger. It's okay, you know, to be upset about injustices towards ourselves or our community or our people we care about. But, you know, if there's like a retaliation and anger to like hurt someone back, I'm not saying like that's the worst thing you do. Sometimes we can't even control it, but just being mindful of that, you know, when you go into anger mode, are you going into like hurt everyone mode, and being more careful of that, and me, I try to like be with my anger. I like to express my anger, but I try not to say intentionally like hurtful things to be like, this is why I'm angry. And I want you to understand why what you did is making me angry. And I'm not saying you're a bad person, that you're a terrible person, but like, I need you to understand why you did what you did and why it caused this reaction in me. And I'd love to understand why you did what you did. Maybe the intention behind it would help ease my anger. So those are some of my thoughts about dealing with anger.
Yeah, I think there's a really important concept that's come up, which is, or at least a distinction, which is the difference between the feelings and the internal experience of anger and the ways that you actually express or deal with it. Because like personally, I have not had much trouble with ways of expressing anger. Like I feel like I don't lose my temper very often at all, but my internal emotional experience with anger has been a lot of what you're saying of like, hold on to it type of thing. And I think it's important to recognize that it does serve a useful purpose. Like you were saying, like it's not something to be avoided, but it is important that once you encounter a scenario or something where anger comes up, the way that you choose to kind of express that or interact with it. Because like when you were saying avenues for expression of anger and that you feel comfortable expressing it, or that like men may feel a little bit more open to expressing it, I feel like there's such a huge range of ways that you can actually express it.
Yeah.
The little song, like the violence end of the spectrum is too far. Like it doesn't really, there are very, very, very few scenarios where it actually serves the intentions that you want to put out, or actually does, or it solves the problem, right, that caused the anger usefully. So I think it's important to kind of take those two things apart. There is the feeling and the relationship with the feeling and the internal experience, and then there's the actual expression of that. And I think depending on who you are, there may be different pieces that you need to focus on for how you're going to deal with it. Like again, for me, the actual expression of it, very, very rarely do I lose my temper. But my relationship with it internally, I've had to like really focus in and think about and process a bunch of different stuff. So that's one thing that I would want to highlight for starting to deal with anger.
I agree. Like everyone's expression of anger can be very different, especially with your upbringing. Like I can imagine maybe an Italian family being more expressive with her. I mean, that's maybe they just talk loudly and that's just kind of how they are. But to like as someone who's not like that, that could just seem like, oh my God, they're so angry. It's like frightening. Whereas like if you were in that family, perhaps that wouldn't be frightening to you. That's just kind of how we do things. But how do you, if you're not like overtly like yelling or being loud, are you just, if someone upsets you, like, do you just say, hey, that thing you did made me angry, like, and this is why? Or like, how does that manifest or get expressed for you?
Yeah, so let me think about that for a second. Because when you said that, I actually immediately thought of the opposite and the times that I have lost my temper, which doesn't answer the question at all. But I think most of the time I am able to get a grasp on when the emotion is building very, very early and say, and either like leave the situation, change it in some way, or directly confront and just say like, hey, so here's the thing, we're I don't know, building a table. I suck at putting stuff together. We're building a table. I'm starting to get frustrated. I'm gonna stop, or like the way you're talking to me right now has not made me angry, but I know it will make me angry soon. Could we maybe think of some alternate strategies for communicating, or like something like that? For me, I'm lucky in the sense that for this particular emotion, I usually get a grasp on it really early and can put some other block in place before things escalate.
Yeah, that's really important. I do, when I notice I'm really upset, I usually do try to get some space and distance. Because if you're like really angry, I feel like I can't always be productive in my conversation and communication. And I might end up saying something like that could be taken the wrong way, especially if I have an angry tone and I'm trying to express something, could definitely get received the not so nice way. So waiting until I can actually be in a space where I can be calm and be more communicative and being more compassionate and understanding in those moments, which is hard when you're angry. That's sometimes more effective for me.
Yeah, I think that, I don't know, I'm just going to jump into strategies a little bit, but I think for me, the most useful thing when I actually do feel like anger to the point of being overwhelmed is to just step out of the situation. And that may just be me not preferring to avoid conflict where possible. But that's usually what I do if I find myself getting too angry that I can't even think straight. Like I said, usually I'm in a place before that to kind of come up with something. But yeah, once it hits that point, I just leave. And that's not always the best thing, but it's the tool that works the best for me to make sure that it doesn't escalate to a point where I'm only making bad decisions.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think when I have to get to that point of just walking away, I do try to communicate like, hey, I definitely want to finish this conversation, but I'm triggered and I'm in a mental space of not being able to have a calm, rational discussion right now. So I just need some space to cool off, and then we can come back to it and complete the conversation at a later time. So yeah, which is hard because, for me, that has taken a lot of training because I'm generally someone who wants to resolve things like ASAP. And then sometimes that just ends up escalating. If you're both angry, then it's just like you say something like when you're upset, and then that upsets that person, and then it's just like a chain reaction. And kind of like, I don't know if I've shared the example of when me and my partner are in an argument in a car. That's always like the worst situation because it's like we can't like take the space to leave and like calm down and then come back together. It just like always escalates typically. But, I think there are tools, even in when you can't like necessarily leave the room or leave the car, just like exit the car. You can just be like, okay, what do I really need right now? Like, what is really upsetting me underneath it? And maybe it just requires like, okay, let's sit quietly right now. Just like calm, even though we can't like be in separate rooms. Maybe we can like just calm down quietly. And yeah, actually, that just happened in the car this past weekend. It wasn't anything major, but there was a misunderstanding. I was like, oh, did you call your dad? Because it was Father's Day. And he was like, oh, yeah, no, my family doesn't really care about like stuff like that, holidays. And I was like, well, you could just text him like Happy Father's Day. And he was like, well, no, it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal to me. It's not a big deal to everyone in the family. And I was like, well, you could still text him because it's like, I don't think it would upset him if you said Happy Father's Day. Like, how dare you say Happy Father's Day? I mean, like, it would just be like, oh, I was thinking of you. And he's like, well, I just do that a lot of days. Why does it have to be Father's Day? And then it was just like this back and forth, and I could feel it escalating. And I was like, okay, I honestly don't even care if you say Happy Father's Day or not. So let's just end it right now. And then we just changed the topic, and we were able to get off of. Whereas before, I think, both of us can be pretty headstrong occasionally, and we want to like win the argument. And it's just like, okay, when you go into the mode of winning the argument, it's that type of mindset means like someone else needs to lose. And that's really not conducive for any relationship, whether it's friendship or romantic. And so it's just like, you have to go back into like, what would win it for both of us? It's like, how do we both win? And if we both win, it's just like, okay, I just got to let go that it really is not a big deal if he says it or not. And I don't have to like, if that's how his family operates, then okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I think adding in that little piece, you mentioned it a while ago, but it applies to what you just said as well, which is kind of having that extra conversation frame. Like you were using it in the context of when you need to bail out of a conversation and just kind of saying like, hey, I want to pick this back up. I'm not in the right state of mind, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I think adding those extra frames can make such a huge difference. Like, I know for the types of fights or escalations or disagreements or whatnot that you were just talking about, there are times with certain people, and obviously not with strangers, but like people I actually know, where I say like, okay, honestly, I don't care about this much. I don't want it to get personal, but I do want to just like fight about this concept. Like I just kind of like arguing sometimes. So it's like, I don't want this to turn into like a real actual heated fight. Let me make that clear up front, which might sound weird. It might sound like a really weird thing to say, but like just letting it know like, okay, ultimately, if you don't want to send this text, I don't care. But I do want to just like spew out all my arguments. Like, don't think that I like actually care or that I feel any differently about you or anything else. But let me just do this. And again, obviously, it really depends on the relationship. But I've found success with that sometimes, where it's just like adding a little bit more of a frame to things. Obviously, if you're way too angry, like you might be in a place where you're not paying close enough attention and you're saying personally hurtful things.
Right.
But I know that for me, a lot of the time, it's not super hard, especially if I pre-frame it to say like, I'm going to attack this idea. I'm going to rip this idea apart. And it has nothing to do with you. But I really want to like get this stuff across. That's something that has worked for me in certain situations.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to kind of set the context of the conversation, because it could escalate and be really messy. And yeah, at the end of the day, does it really matter to me whether that text gets sent? His argument is like he does that regularly and consistently throughout the year, so why does it have to be this government or Hallmark holiday? Like, why does that, like, and I get that, but I'm like, is it really gonna do that much hard to take like a minute to send a text? Like, I'm like, you don't have, I'm not saying you should buy anything, but I think what's upsetting for him when I try to look from his perspective is like, maybe if I'm being like, if I'm pushing my point of view, that it might seem like I'm saying, even though I'm not saying, like there's the judgment of like, you're being a bad son if you don't wish your father a happy Father's Day or something like that. And that could be like propelling his reason for like, this isn't really that important in our family, so why should I matter, kind of a thing. And really in the grand scheme of things, I'm like, does it really? I don't know. Yeah. So I'd be curious to see what his father thinks. So yeah, but maybe I'll ask him the next time I talk with him. Yeah.
That'd be interesting. It was like, I was waiting for that text all day.
All day. I know. Well, TJ said you didn't care, so. Yeah.
Yeah, I really think that makes a big difference. And I also think that it helps make space, right? Like if there's going to be some anger or frustration or whatever else in the conversation, having that frame allows it to be there without it turning into something other than what it is. Again, super context dependent, really depends on the relationship too. Like certain relationships and situations probably shouldn't have space for anger or certain conversations. Like it doesn't make sense, but there are other ones that it makes plenty of sense. I had one other totally separate thing that came to mind, which was another thing that I found really useful. I know I talked about kind of like walking away from situations and leaving those. Obviously, that's not always a possibility. I found that my meditation practice, or at least the specific part of tuning into breathing and my body, can make a huge difference if I can't leave. So I think we talked about sounds a while ago. There are certain sounds that drive me nuts. If I'm in a situation where that sound is just going to be there, and I feel like anxiety, frustration, anger, whatever those negative emotions are, I've really found that just tuning into my breath, slowing down, nice like deep breaths, and I think we've talked about it before too, just like altering my physiology a little bit by just chilling out. That helps a lot in situations where I may not have the power to actually change the situation. I only have the ability to kind of adjust how I'm dealing with it.
Yeah, that's really important, because we can't always change, or oftentimes we can't change the circumstances. People are going to be people. It's like they can drive us crazy and annoy us and frustrate us and whatever. And it's like, instead of trying to change them, it's like what you always have control is yourself. And I agree, mindfulness, breathing exercises, or just having a consistent meditation practice, or just consistent self-reflection practice is really a great way to, be able to manage your anger more frequently. And actually, I think another idea to add to the table is just, having like professional support with a therapist, or some sort of professional that can like give you insight on what is really underneath all that anger, because underneath it might not be the action itself, or it's really like this underlying story, like, you know, maybe my partner getting upset over me suggesting the idea of texting Happy Father's Day. Underneath that was like this idea. I'm just pulling at straw. I don't know if this is a reality of situation. I don't know his experience, but just like an idea, like underneath that could be like, I'm not good enough. I'm not a good son. I'm not worthy. Like all of that backstory, when in reality, I'm just like giving an idea. And maybe like there's this underneath, like, I'm not good enough. That's kind of filtering or just kind of like shadowing the outline. And so that causes the trigger response for someone. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to note, that it is not super close to my experience, but I have seen in other people, which is when you get a good grasp on your relationship with anger, if you find that it's outsized, I guess, like showing up in a lot of situations for a lot of things and at an intensity that feels really high, that's probably a good thing to explore further with some outside help. I'm not super familiar with that, but I do know I can think of at least one person who just have the most, it seemed to me, random anger outbursts. Like the most small thing would happen and it would be like a roulette wheel, whether or not like they were just going to blow up for no reason. And after having some conversations with them, I don't know what the specific issue was, but they got some external help and realized that there was something else that would often get funneled into anger at other trivial things. So if that's something that people are dealing with, that's definitely an avenue worth exploring, because I know for some people, anger really reduces the quality of a lot of experiences.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's helpful to know what are the things, what's underneath, what is the real trigger behind these things. Because I will tell you, for most people, if you notice yourself getting angry consistently, there's probably like an underlying theme for a lot of those incidences if you really break it down. And for me, one thing that I've discovered in a lot of like personal development work that I've done was something that triggers me is the story of like, and especially in relationships, romantic relationships with men, is the idea of like, he doesn't care, is like sabotaging a lot of my relationships from my 20s and even in my 30s too, where it was just like anything that he does that feels like he doesn't care, like he doesn't text me back right away, or, you know, he hasn't even like reached out in a few days. How dare he doesn't care? And it's just like I go into that mindset. I have since caught it. Like I'm more mindfulness, and it just like that has manifested from my relationship with my father. Like as a child, it just was like, oh, it feels like my father doesn't care because he never went to my swim meets and all that thing. And that's just like a story I created. In reality, he does care. It's just like his expression of it was maybe I didn't fully get the full extent of his care, or just that he was like dealing with life. And, you know, it's just, yeah. And the one example I had, like actually in the beginning of my relationship, my current relationship, I remember getting in a big fight over him. I don't know if I forget what stories I've told it and whatnot. But we got in a big fight about, he was like working 60 hours a week. And I was really upset with him because it just felt like he was constantly prioritizing work over me. Someone he's saying he cares about a lot, and I'm like, well, then why do you keep doing overtime? And someone who doesn't take a stand and set boundaries at work, it's like, why aren't you doing that? It's like, if you really care, then you should be doing like X, Y, and Z and setting the boundaries and all that. And I wasn't being fully understanding of like his situation, his circumstances, and maybe that wouldn't be so easy. And for me to like get upset over feeling like he doesn't care when even though he's honestly saying he does care, but I'm just like believing that's not true. And that was fueling my anger and getting really upset with him and almost messed up our relationship from the beginning. But I was able to catch that. Actually, what helped me catch that was me noticing that my mother was getting angry at my father for a very similar reason. And she was like, oh, he doesn't care. He's like not doing this. And I was like, do you realize like all these things that dad has going on, that he's just like swamped and like drowning with all this stuff? So the fact that he doesn't respond right away doesn't mean he doesn't care. It's just like he's dealing with his life and it's a lot. And I was like, oh my God, I'm doing the same thing as my mother. And then I apologized to my boyfriend. I was like, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I was shaping my action was the idea of like, he doesn't care. And when I could give that up, then I could just be like, with the reality of the situation was like, yeah, he's just working overtime. I should be more supportive of that fact. And yeah, I mean, it's not conducive for a relationship, but I can't create this story of he doesn't care when that's not true.
Yeah, I think that goes back to kind of what we were talking about at the start too, in terms of, or at least what I was saying, figuring out what the emotion is trying to tell you or what you can actually do about it. At least for me, that makes such a big difference in terms of like, if I start feeling angry and I start searching around for like, okay, instead of only feeling angry, like, what do I do about this? What does this mean? Where is this coming from? What is the point of this? And again, in the moment may not be the best time to do it. It may be too difficult. It may be a little bit outside of the scope of what's available, depending on how intense the emotion is. But definitely later, afterwards, going back and going like, okay, I got angry because someone said I couldn't do this thing. Why does that make me angry? Why do I care about that? What does it mean?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I haven't done enough work around that to have the answer off the top of my head, but I'm sure it's something around like a fear of being judged incompetent at things, and wanting to take action to not have that. And there are two pieces, which are, one, I can work on the actual, solution to the problem that anger seems to be showing on the surface, or I can work on my actual relationship with that deeper, more core item. And depending on how those things play out, like in my specific situation, it probably makes sense to do both. Like, hey, there's probably a nugget in here for how I can improve my performance, as well as I probably shouldn't be so caught up in what other people think of my performance. Like, it should only be based on what outcomes this actually influences. If it's important to my life, then maybe it's worth digging into a little bit. But if it's just some random person told me I'm not good at this thing, then like, why am I sitting on this and letting it happen? Which is all to say that I think it's really useful. Again, maybe not in the moment. If you're super awesome, you could probably do it in the moment, but to do a retrospective and just say like, here's what happened. Here's what made me angry. Why did this happen? What can I do about it? What pieces should I be looking at?
Right. Yeah. It actually just reminded me of something one of my coaches had told me, in that, when we're angry about something, we ourselves kind of believe that there is just like a little grain of truth in it. And that is what's making us upset. Like, for an employer to say, oh, you're underperforming. And if you honestly believe you were performing at your highest and your best, and you weren't underperforming yourself, then that might not upset you, because there's like no truth to that. Like, I remember someone like yelling at me, being like, you have no friends, no one cares about you. And I was like, that doesn't affect me, because I know that's absolutely not true, Elise, and I don't even know where you're coming up with this, but I get that's like your reaction and whatever's going on. But maybe like underneath it, you're like thinking, oh, maybe like I didn't do as good as I could be doing, or something to that extent. Because the example you used was like, if someone called you a horse, you wouldn't be upset because there's like no truth. It was like, why would you? That's weird. But when someone said, I was like, not, I was kind of being, what was the word? Or just kind of like not being as well-intentioned or as honorable as I could be. And I was like, how dare you? I'm such an honorable and well-intentioned person. And I was just like, oh, when I look back at it, I'm like, oh, maybe I was kind of trying to be sneaky and not as well-intentioned. Maybe I did have underlying motives. When I really reflect on it, if it really had any truth, then I shouldn't be so upset. So that's just an idea. I don't know how accurate or that is, but just something I'm throwing out there.
Yeah, I have some resonance and some pushback, which is to say that in a lot of situations, that is true. And there are many, many interactions where basically someone can throw out some sort of judgment, and if you have some sort of sensitivity to some part of it already, it might strike a nerve and cause some anger. The part that I want to push back on a little bit is the like no truth part, which I think is true if the external judgment has no bearing on your life. So again, some random person says like, you're a camel, right? Like, okay, great. I don't know what to do with that. That doesn't mean anything to me. But if you were trying to get into like a grocery store and somebody's like, sorry, no camels allowed, you'd be like, oh my, what the hell? Like, I need to get in here. I need to get food. And like, no, you're a camel. Like, I'm not a camel. Like, that's not a thing. So I think it can really like, when there is a judgment that you don't perceive to be true, that also has an impact on your life. Even if there's no truth in it whatsoever, I do think that is a source of anger in some instances, just because it's like, I don't know, like, I need to fix this perception. Otherwise I have to face consequences. Right. So again, anger and like aggression are probably not the best way to do that, but it's a very typical response, I think, and a very common, again, the emotion saying like, you need to take action on this. You're going to face some sort of consequences for something you don't think is real at all. So like, you need to do something. I think that's a case where there doesn't have to be any truth in what the judgment is. Like, hey, you're completely underperforming. Like, I'm doing the best I can, and I'm doing more than everyone else. Like, yep, well, you're still getting fired. You know what I mean? Like, so when there's actually an impact, then I think that's the distinction.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like, thinking about the impact, that changes the game for sure. When there's like a big consequence or impact, if that perception doesn't get shifted. Yes, but for the most part, I don't feel like when it's interacting at the grocery store, there's not usually a big impact if someone thinks you're a camel. Or another example is like if I accidentally cut someone off on the highway, which I never intentionally try to cut anyone off on the highway, but sometimes I'm not always like present to all my surroundings, and then all of a sudden there's a car and I'm like, oops. And you know, that could cause an anger reaction for someone and being like, oh, what a bitch, how dare she try to like be. And I'm just like, but honestly, like, they can think that about me and it has no bearing on my life, because it's like, I'm never going to see that person probably ever again. So what does it matter if they think I'm a terrible person for cutting them up, even though I know that I didn't intentionally do that.
Yeah. And I think just to, I don't know, further highlight it, this might not actually work, but if they were to follow you all the way to wherever you're going and then get out and like start screaming at you, then like you would very much want to like, that was not intentional. Like, that was not on purpose. Again, this is like an already super escalated situation that I just set up, so it's already sketch. But like in that case, you would want them to know. Like, I didn't need to do that. But yeah, for the most part, I agree. I think most interactions do not fall in that bucket, especially ones where perceptions are so far off from each other. Like where you believe there's no truth in what happened. Usually what's probably more accurate is you get some sort of feedback like, hey, you should interact with your teammates more. And you're like, yeah, I probably should. You know, like there's usually at least a little bit of truth in those impactful interactions. And then the non-impactful ones are much more common and much easier to kind of dismiss.
Right. Yeah. And going back to your example, if like someone had taken it to the extreme and followed me to just yell at me, I would be like, I would want to explain myself, but I'm like, man, if you're this angry in life, I know it has nothing to do with me. And you getting so triggered by someone cutting you off, it's just like, there's got something in your life is clearly not working for you, and you're really upset about that. And I'm sorry, tell me what's going on. Just like, that has happened to me where I'm like, I get yelled at for like something so minor, and I'm like, clearly you've got other issues that in your life that you're dealing with, and if someone were to blow up so easily over something so minute, it's just like, yeah, they got something else going on. And you know, instead of me being like angry back, being like, why are you getting so crazy at me over this like minute such thing to go to the extreme of following me and to just yell at me, it's like, maybe they do need to like release that steam, because they've got some stuff going on. And to be able to be like a person who listen, I can't say how any conversation is going to go, but sometimes just being a space of like, I'm not saying it's okay to just do that and yell at people and just do that, but as long as there's no physical harm, hopefully, that someone just needs to like vent and yell at someone just to get it out of their chest so they don't like yell at their child or something like that. And I'm like, sure, I'll take it for you, and be like, wow, you must have a hard life or something like that.
Yeah. I think that highlights, thinking from the other perspective, another important point, which is like, once you've hit that point, once you're at the point of screaming at someone you don't know on a side street or something,
Mm-hmm.
you've already like let your emotion build to such a high level that I personally don't know of any tools, because at that point, when I have those kinds of outbursts, I'm not thinking at all. I'm just doing whatever nonsense I'm doing. Right. So I think it's important to note, as we're talking about dealing with anger, the place to deal with anger is before that. Like, if you want to have any hope of converting your anger response into something that's like, I don't know, more mellow or just constrained within the bounds of what you actually want to do, it has to be before that point. Or at least, I mean, there might be tools for that, but I know personally, when I'm at that level of anger, there's no rational thoughts. There's nothing coming into my head. I'm just acting whatever super anger thing is going on. I don't know the ways to slow down when I'm already in that state, but I know there are always, every time I've ever been in that state, there are always multiple points beforehand of like, I can bail out here. I can bail out here. I can do this thing to chill out. I can do this thing to chill out. So I think and again, there might be other strategies that I don't know about, but for me, I think it's extremely important to be able to notice earlier and kind of use some of these other release valves so that you can make the types of choices you want to when you actually end up exhibiting your anger in somewhere or making your response.
Yeah, it just made me think of like an alternate scenario of it would be kind of an extreme reaction if it was just being upset over someone like cutting you off. But what if it was like someone like crashed into you, like messed up your car, and then you like drove off, and then you're following that person, and I'm just like, I honestly don't even know how I would handle the situation. I'm just thinking that would trigger the injustice. You did something wrong. You did something that you shouldn't do to me, kind of a reaction. So yeah, I should follow you because you can't get away with this kind of a thing. So, any thoughts?
Yeah, for me, I mean, it gets a little bit trickier just because those situations, I think they're a lot harder to break down because they're so much more intense that the right choice to make in the moment is hard to determine. It's so much easier to talk about like these slower builds, this other like,
right.
If you have a history of like blowing up over small things, if you have like, it's so much easier to look at these points when things are slower and kind of figure out what the best decision to make is. When you're in a situation that's like life or death or very just high intensity, like you were saying, like somebody crashes into your car. I don't know if I have as good or clear of thoughts or guidance around these kinds of things, because a lot of times it's not really like my whole thing, or at least the things that I know best are like slowing down, making rational choices, figuring stuff out. Like that doesn't really apply to these situations a lot of the time because you have to make decisions super fast. And it's just not a realm that I am as equipped or familiar with. I'm more familiar with like, cool, I got in a fight at soccer for no reason. Like, how do I not do that in the future? Because I was stupid. But not like, hey, someone tried to kill me at soccer. Like, what am I supposed to, like, so for me, that realm was a little bit tougher to come down with a really nice answer. But at the core, same thing I've been saying, like, I think anger kind of provokes a response and it is meaningful. So if there is a situation that causes a ton of anger, it's probably also going to produce a response. Whether or not that's the right response or how to make the best response in such a short time period, I don't have any real good ideas for how to make sure that's the case.
Right. Yeah, I think it kind of comes down to like how much control do I have over the situation. Like if he drives off and there's no way I could catch up to him if he crashed into my car, which actually that did happen in Seattle one time where I was at a stoplight, and I don't know if I was in the front, but then there was a car behind me, but then there was this truck that was rolling down the hill and like crashed in the car behind me, and that car rolled into my car, and then that truck just like sped off. And I think someone tried to follow him, but we weren't able to catch him. But ultimately, it was just like, there's really nothing I can do in that situation. So I can be really angry about it and let it ruin the rest of my day. Or I can choose to be like, that's the situation. It really sucks. And yeah, sometimes people are jerks and they hightail it when they crash into a car, which is not right. But it doesn't have to like ruin the rest of my week. It doesn't have to ruin like the rest of my month. And yeah, in the grand scheme of things, if it's like, yeah, a little, it does cost some money to fix, but in the long term, it's, I still have a driving workable car. So ultimately it's not impacting me in a huge way when I really like break it down. Yeah. And people can't really do anything about the situation. It's like, it's the situation. It's done. He's gone. That's how it is sometimes.
Yeah, that's what I was going to touch on. Is I think it drops back, that scenario drops back into that space where you have a little bit more time to kind of like break things apart, and it really just comes down to what can you actually do? What does keeping the anger do for you? How does it serve you? And it doesn't. Like if that guy takes off and nobody got his license plate or anything, like there's no action that you can take that fixes it. And it sucks because it's not fair, and maybe that's another one of the trigger points that make people angry, is when things aren't fair. But that's just part of life. Like, it sucks. It's not fair that you were just sitting there and got hit by somebody else and have to pay to get it fixed. Mm-hmm. But again, the anger, sitting in the anger and just like keeping it and holding on to it and replaying it doesn't produce anything. It doesn't cheapen your car repairs. It doesn't give you the license plate. It doesn't do anything.
Right. Yes. If anything, if I just held on to that anger and I was just angry around everyone I interacted with, even though they didn't do anything, then that's just like, that doesn't really help me either. If I like carry that anger on, and like, let's say I go into a coffee shop and I'm like really angry and I'm just like an asshole about how slow they are at making my coffee or something like that. And it's just really, it's like that's not even deserved. They didn't do anything. I was just dealing with whatever it is, and I don't have to pass that anger along to whoever else I interact with. And that's, I think, something to be mindful of, is just like, yeah, it's okay to be angry, but it's like, if you're carrying that anger on to like people who did nothing to invoke that anger, they're just like going about their day, or maybe they got your order wrong and it was an accident and it wasn't anything intentional, but it's just like being mindful of like, do you want to carry that anger on? And it's like, what's that impact going to be on you and your life and your relationships?
Yeah, I think that's really important, and something that I have dealt with before and seen in other people. And it doesn't do anything. It doesn't help with the situation. It creates more negative situations, and you just end up with a complete net loss. Now, it can be a little bit harder than just saying like, just don't be angry anymore. Like, obviously it can take some effort to like tune into it and really think about it and work through it. And if you have like a history or habitual ways of like dealing with anger, it might take some time to unwind that. But realistically, when you look at the impacts and you look at the net gains and losses from carrying these emotions around and not figuring out tools to work through them, or figuring out ways to not carry them into other interactions, you're going to be way, way better off if you take the time to figure out whatever it is for you that happens to work.
Right. Yeah. Right. Great. Well, I think we covered the topic pretty well. Was there anything else that you had left to say?
Nope. That's all of the ideas that I had.
All right. Great. Well, thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.
You can check out more content at howtohappy.com. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you can stay up to date on the videos. We've also got a Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook that you can check out. See you next time.